They said the water began to tremble before his body touched it, as if it knew what was coming and tried to pull away from the fire. It was a morning without sun, the sky a flat lid over London, and yet the heat at Smithfield was already building, stacked under iron and red stone and the slow, restless crowd. In the center of the open ground stood the thing they had come to see, not a gallows, not a block of fresh scraped wood, but a vast iron pot resting on a bed of brick and flame, its rim blackened, its sides sweating with the first shy beads of steam. The rope that would lift a man's weight creaked softly, answering the murmur of voices like an animal waking. Before the cauldron, there had been a kitchen, and before the kitchen, there had been a boy who learned the language of heat long before he learned the language of law. Richard Roose had spent his life in the service rooms of other men's comfort, in cellars where the air was thick with smoke and meat and shouted orders. The bishop's house at Lambeth had its own kind of holiness, but in the depths where the cauldron stood, nothing was holy except timing, flame, and the patience of water that waited to be told what to become. He knew how broth thickened as it cooled along the edge of the pot, how a careless hand could blister for days, how fat floated in pale moons on the surface and broke when disturbed. They would say later that he was never more than a shadow in the household, a man whose name changed on the lips of those who barely saw him. Some called him cook, some servant, some simply the fellow from Rochester who kept the pots filled. It was said that he laughed easily, that he had the rough humor of men who live among bones and offal. It was also said that he once stared too long into a boiling kettle and told another boy that all punishments begin with hunger. Whether any of this was true would be eaten by the same heat that now licked the stones at Smithfield. On that winter day in Lambeth, the poison had no color. It came as a white powder, carried in a stranger's story and offered with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Roose would later insist that he had been told it would only sicken, that it was a joke meant to leave his fellow servants groaning and weakened, nothing more. When the powder left his fingers and fell into the pottage, when he stirred and watched it vanish into the familiar swirl, there was no flash of magic, no crack in the world, only the soft, thick sound of food being made for those who would never rise from their beds again. The bishop did not eat that day. Fasting, perhaps out of piety, perhaps out of habit, he passed the dish to others. 2 of them died, one of his own household, one a beggar who had come with an empty bowl and left with a stomach full of poison. Many more shook and retched and cried out. Panic moved through the house like smoke, searching for a draught to escape by. In those hours, kitchens and corridors were thick with the smell of bile and fear, and somewhere in that chaos, the line between sin and treason was redrawn by a king who had not been there to smell any of it. Henry already feared poison the way some men fear the dark. To him it was a hidden rebellion in powder form, a treachery that needed no army. When word reached him that a bishop who stood in the path of his desires had narrowly escaped such a death, the incident grew in his mind beyond kitchens and clumsy jokes. Parliament heard his voice before it heard the evidence. Murder by poison would be called treason, and treason would be punished not by rope or sword, but by boiling, as if the crime itself demanded to be answered in water. What had been a cook's blunder or a pawn's obedience now became a lesson for a whole city. Roose did not stand before a jury of peers. He stood inside a piece of theater written in advance. Attainted by statute, he found his guilt declared in words he had never heard, while somewhere in the background an old fear, older than kings, older than courts, whispered that the body must be made to suffer in a way that matched the invisible horror of poison. There is a certain comfort in symmetry when justice forgets mercy. So they built the fire. Smithfield had seen death before. Men had burned there when faith turned to fuel. Others had hanged and swung in the wind, their bodies turning slowly as crows measured the distance. But boiling was different, new on the lips of the people, obscene in its intimacy. A gallows lifted a man away from the earth. A fire reduced him to ash. The cauldron promised something slower, a punishment that lived in the stretched-out space between first contact and final silence. The iron pot was filled with water and set over a great bed of coals. There was wood enough for hours of burning, piled and ready. As the heat gathered, the first faint threads of steam climbed into the cold air, shredded by the breeze, then grew thicker and more insistent. The surface moved from stillness to a slow pulse, each tremor answering the rise of the flames beneath. A chain hung above the open mouth of the vessel, ending in iron that would close around a man's body like a second skin. Whispers spread that they had brought him early, in the gray hour when market stalls were still being raised, so that the crowd would have time to grow around him, so that children could be lifted onto shoulders and learn what the crown did to those who played with powders and priests. It was said that he looked small beside the cauldron, more like fuel than a fender. Some claimed that he begged, that he screamed, that he named names in a rush of terror. Yet many believe this is courtyard gossip rather than record. What cannot be disputed is that he was bound in chains, his arms pinned, his body made helpless long before the water touched him. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars would later describe how they lowered him into the water and raised him again, not once but several times, as if to lengthen the lesson until every corner of the square had heard its full length. The chain groaned as it took his weight, metal against metal, then the slow descent began. For a moment his feet hovered above the surface, where steam rose in soft ghostly wreaths, then his skin met the heat. There is a point where water stops being a comfort and becomes an instrument. At first the shock is all the body can understand, a white blank pain that wipes out thought. Then the outer skin begins to change, to redden, to swell, to open. The hiss that goes up is not only the sound of liquid rolling, it is the sound of flesh trying and failing to defend itself. Those who stood close enough that day would never again hear a pot boil without remembering the way his voice broke when the water closed over his knees, his waist, his chest. They did not drown him cleanly. That would have been almost merciful. Instead they lifted him, the chain rattling, his body shining and ruined, then let him hang above the cauldron while the air struck his burns like needles. Then down again, into the rolling heat. Eyewitnesses wrote of how his skin slipped from him in sheets, how the water took on a cloudy pallor, how the smell rose above the smoke, an odor that clung to hair and cloth long after the fire died. For nearly 2 hours, by some accounts, the spectacle continued, the pot swallowing his cries and giving them back in broken fragments. According to some Londoners, the crowd grew restless not from pity, but from horror, as if they had come to see a man punished and instead found themselves watching something that rearranged the shape of punishment itself. Some claimed that a woman at the front fainted, that a child began to scream and could not be comforted. Yet modern scholars believe these are more likely embellishments than evidence, the city's attempt to give itself a conscience after the fact. The record that remains speaks mainly of the length of the death and the quiet satisfaction of the authorities who turned away once the body stopped moving. In the cool rooms where royal officers kept their ink and their ledgers, the new law sat on the page in neat lines: murder by poison tied forever to boiling as treason. It would not last long. A few more victims would feel the bite of the cauldron, a serving girl here, another condemned poisoner there, and then the next reign would call the statute too severe, too straight, too terrible, and strip it away. Hanging would return as the ordinary answer, burning for women, rope for men, death simplified again. But on that day in Smithfield, simplicity was not what the crown wanted. It wanted a sign. It wanted to act out the crime in reverse, to throw a body into water until poison itself seemed to cower. If broth had been turned into a weapon, then boiling would become the king's reply. The cook who once leaned over steaming pots to feed a bishop now became the meat in a pot meant to feed the fear of others. There is a kind of cold arithmetic in that, colder even than the winter air that wrapped itself around the square and refused to enter the heat. After it was done, when the chain finally lifted nothing but a slack shape that no longer resembled a man, the crowd began to loosen, to drift away into the streets. Markets resumed, carts rolled. life knitted itself back together across the seams of horror. Some carried the story home as a warning, others as entertainment, a tale to be repeated at ale benches and in firelit rooms. Roose himself left nothing to counter them, no letters, no last words that could be trusted. His name would blur and shift in chronicles, sometimes Roose, sometimes Rosu, sometimes only the cook. The law would remember him more clearly than any neighbor. In legal arguments for years to come, his boiling would be cited as a turning point, an example of how swiftly a king's fear could harden into statute. Historians would look back and see in that cauldron not only a single man's agony, but the willingness of power to reshape punishment so that it no longer matched the body, but the mood of the throne. When a ruler feels threatened, even water can become a weapon. In the end, what remains is not his face or his voice, but the image of a man whose life among kettles and fires ended in a vessel larger than any kitchen had ever held. A pot that once meant nourishment became an altar of pain. The same rising bubbles that once promised warmth now mark each step toward oblivion. Somewhere beyond the smoke, church bells may have been ringing the same as any morning, their notes falling through the air while flesh tore quietly in the boil below. The city would forget many of its hangings, many of its nameless dead, but the story of the cook who was boiled alive under Henry would cling to its stones, resurfacing whenever people spoke of old punishments and the strange appetite of power for spectacle. And so the question that lingers is not whether Richard Roose was guilty of more than foolishness or obedience, but what it does to a kingdom when justice finds its reflection, not in the calm surface of law, but in the rolling, ruthless water of a cauldron.